Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock, Drogheda. All this week, Janice and I are in the Middle East, and so I decided to pre-record several videos speaking about the reality of Christianity in the Middle East. Obviously, quite a turbulent part of the world, and in many Middle Eastern countries, a difficult place to be a Christian and to share the gospel. A couple of years back, I was in Lebanon. And while I was there, I met a lady who told me her testimony and it was an absolutely incredible testimony of God's delivering power. It was whenever the civil war was taking place in Lebanon, and it was the very last day before the Syrian troops were going to leave Beirut. And they were going on this mad killing spree. They were basically going round on the final day that they were able to kill people and carrying out all sorts of atrocities. And this lady and her family were basically stopped by a Syrian army patrol and told that they were going to be executed. And they were put up against a wall in front of a Syrian firing squad. There was this particular lady, there was her husband, and she had her son with her. And so she's standing against a wall, facing a firing squad, holding her son's hand. And as she's praying, this is what she was praying. She said, "I hope my son and my husband die before I do, because I don't want them to have the pain of watching me die." And then she closed her eyes as the officer in charge of the firing squad told his soldiers to take aim. She closed her eyes. She heard him shout, "Fire!" And there was then a huge bang. A few minutes later, she finds herself lying on her back, looking up at the sky. She wondered if she was in heaven. Had she died and gone to heaven? And she looked around, and no, unfortunately, if this was heaven, heaven looked very much like the dirty street in Beirut, where she had been put up against a wall by a firing squad. Then she realized her husband and son were lying beside her, and they were all unhurt and unharmed. And she looked over to where the firing squad had stood, and every one of them was dead. What had happened was a Lebanese tank had come around the corner just as the execution was taking place, and just as the Syrian officer shouted fire to the firing squad, the tank had fired a shell into the firing squad, killing every one of them. And so this woman knew that she and her family had been delivered by the power of the Lord. There were two things that came out of that incident. One was a distrust that would last for many, many years of Syria and Syrian people and Syrian politicians and Syrian forces. But the other thing that came to her was that her son's life had been spared for a reason. And so she prayed that her son would grow up to serve the Lord. And the most amazing thing is that her son did grow up to serve the Lord, and he actually grew up to lead a ministry helping Syrian refugees. And this lady was absolutely appalled by this, because her son's life had been saved from the Syrians by an incredible moment of deliverance. And whenever she began seeing all these Syrian refugees fleeing across the border, and many of them young men, strong young men with beards, looked just like the kind of people she was most afraid of, looked like the kind of men who had lined her and her family up against a wall and prepared to shoot them. And yet her prayer was answered, and her son ended up with this ministry of ministering to Syrian refugees. And you know, Lebanon is doing an amazing work caring for refugees. Sometimes people say, well, why are all the refugees, why are European countries expected to look after them? What about Middle Eastern countries? Well, the fact is that countries like Jordan and Lebanon spend massive amounts of their GDP. I mean, I'm talking about 100 times as much as a percentage of their GDP than any European country in sharing for refugees. And Syria, with a total population of only 6 million people, of those 1.5 million are refugees. And God is using Lebanese Christians to touch and change the lives of Syrian refugees, including a young man whose life was saved years before from a Syrian firing squad by an act of incredible grace from God. There are some amazing things happening in the Middle East. And in fact, there will be a little bit of a follow-up to the story that I've shared with you today. And so join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.